Welcome to the Slingshot Group podcast. I'm your host, Tim Foote, CEO of Slingshot Group, where we build remarkable teams through staffing and coaching. And I am so excited to have with me today for this episode in person, Glenn Packiam. Glenn, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Tim. Great to be here with you and looking forward to this conversation.
Have had so much respect for you, Glenn, and just watching how you have gone from strength to strength in your ministry, influence and impact, but also how you've just reinvented your ministry over and over again as God has led you into new places and new territories, now from Colorado to California. Just give a quick snapshot, if you wouldn't mind, just of your ministry journey for some of our listeners and watchers that may not be familiar.
Well, I was at, I'm right now I'm at Rockharbor Church. I'm the lead pastor there and I've been there for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was at New Life Church in Colorado Springs, and I was there for 22 years and held a variety of different roles. I mean, I got there when I was 22. So, I started out as like an apprentice in the worship office and then became a worship pastor and worked with the college ministry and, all of this, next gen type stuff. In 2009, I began shepherding a evening service, the Sunday night community, did that for 2.5 years, and then launched our first offsite congregation, which the way New Life does those is it's multi-site, but with some sort of autonomy to those congregations. So I led New Life downtown for 10 years. And then also served as, associate senior pastor. So I was involved with the model, coaching some of the other pastors and all that. And then the Lord called us in a really beautiful way to come out here to Costa Mesa and to serve an amazing church that we fell in love with right away. So here we are.
How surprising was it after 22 years in one place to get that call?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was not surprising to receive some invitations only because sometimes when you're in a church like New Life, there are people who say, maybe we'll invite this person to apply for this thing or that, so there were different ones on the team that would get some invitations here and there. But Rockharbor is a church that I have looked up to and admired from afar. And I've known, I knew Todd Proctor. I've known Todd for a number of years. But when the call came, it just seemed like, no, this can't be, the Lord can't be in this. We're on a certain, trajectory or whatever, a pathway. And somehow it was one of those things where I felt like we couldn't let go of it. And we kept revisiting it. But Tim, it took time. I mean, from the first phone call to our yes, in writing, was not quite 18 months, but man, pretty close. It was like March 2021 to June of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Glenn, that we work with ministry organizations, nonprofits, churches, and there are so many different directions I could go with you today.
Yeah,
so many questions I could
listen.
ask, but you have done this big transition and then you've been leading through a season of change. And you wrote a great blog that you should read if you haven't already on Glenn's website called 10 Lessons from a Leadership Transition. And I love that topic. And there's something in that for all of us because all of us at some point are going to go through some transition or as leaders of teams, we're going to lead through transitions. Yeah. So let's hit on a few of those things. We might take all 10 of them.
Sure.
We might have time, but I'll pick and choose a few. But let's dive into a few of them. And first, I'd love to hit on the one that I personally may struggle with the most. Can you guess what that might be?
I'm not going to.
Slowing down. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, first of all, your comment, Tim, about transitions being applicable to a variety of situations, I think that's spot on. And here we are, a few years post-pandemic, right? And yet, I think there's a very real sense when I talk to pastors around the country that they are almost in the process of replanting their churches or rebuilding their churches because there was such a reshuffling of the deck. People left, people came, so in some ways, every pastor feels like, we're in the middle of a transition, and so that idea of slowing down is not one that comes natural to me either.
Right.
I think on the Strengths Finders, one of my top 5 is activator, so if you see the thing like, let's go, let's do this, but I learned something watching the leadership transition, even at New Life that happened 17 years ago. Yeah. Is when you arrive on the scene, people are you're coming into a situation because there's been some measure of difficulty, or at the very least, let's say some measure of disruption. And again, disruption, framing it that way, that applies to all kinds of transitions, right? And when you arrive in a disruption, you have to take time to assess the condition of the people on your team and the people in your church. One of the things I was grateful for is we arrived at the end of August. I wasn't officially set in the role in terms of like preaching and all that until October. So I had about a month. I had that whole month of September where I was working, but not yet, in the pulpit sort of way. And so I took that month and I had about a 90-minute meeting with every single staff person. And just to give, people a sense of the scale, this is about a staff of about 18 to 20 people at the time. So it wasn't, so daunting that you couldn't get through that, but yet, significant. And what I wanted to know in each of these conversations was, tell me a bit of your story. Like, tell me how you discerned this sense of call into church. And then I wanted to know, tell me about your passion. Like, what's the thing that sets you on fire? What's the thing you're passionate about? And then tell me about the fit of this role for you. Like, what's this been like? And then finally, tell me sort of any aspirations you have for your future. And when I sat down, almost every single one of them, Tim, at some point began to tear up and cry. And they would each say, one-on-one, but at some point they would say, I don't know why I'm crying. And I thought, I think I do. And I could say that with empathy because I had been on the other side of that. When we had the Ted Haggard scandal at New Life in 2006, and then the transition, new pastor came in 2007, there were so many complicated emotions. There were so many different, wounds. And I learned that part of what you're paying attention to as a leader, especially with your team, volunteers or staff, you're asking yourself, Lord, am I seeing weariness or am I seeing woundedness? And I think both of those things can show up in similar ways, but they're very different. A person who's weary just needs, let's give them an extended break, maybe a sabbatical. But if a person's wounded, actually what we need is some professional help, some counselors, some therapy, maybe also a break. But you can't rest your way into health or wholeness. You have to be able to get the help that you need for that. So you can't just say, okay, guys, sorry, it's been a tough time. Let's go charge another hill. Again, if you're weary or if you're wounded, you're going to respond differently to that. So slowing down is so important to assess the condition of the team, to assess the condition of the church before you can begin to act. And, some people come in and they have vision pre-packed and they're ready to go. To me, that would have been a mistake. For me, that would have been a mistake because it was not about me sort of exporting or kind of bringing in this pre-packaged vision or plan. I really believe that there's this kind of missional mindset of saying, Lord, what are you doing in this context and in this season? Time and place, this context and this season. You have to know what time it is and you have to know where you are in order to know what you're going to do and how you're going to lead.
Glenn, that's a top learning. And many, many leaders of organizations are like you. They're activators. How do you... Was this something that came naturally to you, or did you have to self-talk? Did you pre-plan it? How did you step into that slower pace?
I have benefited from the wisdom of so many people, Tim, that I'm not even sure I could name all of them. But I've talked to people who've gone through transitions. I've paid attention to how it felt on the other end of receiving a new pastor coming in. I watched some of the things that he did that were helpful. And then even, when I left Colorado, I handed over New Life Downtown to a really good friend of mine, Jason Jackson. And when he was coming in, a few years prior to that, he told me this story of going skydiving, and it's just stuck with me. And he said, his skydiving instructor said, remember that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I thought, that's it. Because you do want to go fast, but the only way you can go fast is if it's smooth, but it won't be smooth unless you slow down. So that's the key. And I think transitions, because they're coming right after disruptions, there are built-in bumps. Yeah. And you can accelerate through bumps, but man, that's not going to be fun for anybody. But if you slow down, you find that place of smoothness, and then smooth ends up being fast.
Such a powerful learning, Glenn, that slow is smooth and smooth is fast, and then that whole metaphor of skydiving. Yeah. Often when we're coaching leaders through transition, we'll talk about the parachute drop and how you drop into this new forest, and you've got to assess your surroundings, which is what you're doing with those leaders. And then also the key leaders that are around you, they need to block for you. They know the surroundings. They know the landmines, and they need to assist in those transitions too. So those are great learnings. I'm excited about this next lesson and intrigued. Honor your inheritance. Talk about that one.
I was conscious coming in that I was standing on someone else's shoulders, that I was reaping where someone else had sown. And this was actually one of the things I learned by watching Brady at New Life when he came in. He used the biblical story of moving the bones of Joseph, when the people left Egypt. And I think there's something there about remembering your inheritance, remembering what you've come from. And it's very difficult sometimes, again, sometimes there is a transition because something was painful. And so the temptation then is to kind of say, well, let's just cut all of that out. We don't want to remember it. It's a new day, And leaders who do that, I think, are making a mistake, because the tares always grow up with the wheat. And you can't throw the whole thing out. You have to say, hang on, some of this is actually worth fighting for. Some of this is worth affirming and blessing. And I think one of the beautiful things that happened, it's a gift that I was given coming into Rockharbor, is the chairman of the elder board and the executive pastor, and a few others, did what they jokingly refer to as the reconciliation tour. And so they used kind of this year and a half of in-between time to actually go and find key people, either former staff people, former elders, that maybe had been hurt over the years because of various bumps, disruptions, mishandling of, and they tried to sit down with them and apologize where appropriate, mend fences, do what they could to repent and restore some measure of peace. And in some of those cases, it resulted in a person, being able to return to the community at Rockharbor. So when I heard about that story, Tim, I was like, okay, this is a church that is not wasting a transition time.
Right.
So, we can talk about this as if it's all up to the leader. So much of what contributes to a leader's quote unquote success is the pre-work that the church does before the leader arrives.
Yeah.
And I was blessed to have a church that did some beautiful pre-work that led to this. It's easy to bless that. It's easy to honor that. And I think it doesn't mean that you can't leave it. It doesn't mean that you can't build on it or move in a slightly different direction or even a dramatically different direction. But honoring your inheritance allows you to say, these are the gifts of who we are and who we've been. And now, here's how we can move forward. And, actually, we talk about these as biblical principles. But the best companies understand that this is a key prerequisite of any strat op is like, we need to know, where have we been? Yeah. What are these key turning points and in our story? And therefore, where are we now? And then therefore, where do we want to go? But it's ironic to me that Christian leaders, the ones who are supposed to say, remember what the Lord has done. Let's set up these memorial stones on the banks of the Jordan before we go into the promised land all the way, right? We're supposed to know better. Yes. And yet we kind of act like the story started with us. And man, it did not start with you. It did not start with me. The Lord has been on the scene. He's been working. Let's just humbly take our place in the story.
We're not that smart. We're not that good.
No.
Yeah.
No, and you got to, one of the things, this is a common saying, but Brady used to say this all the time at New Life as well, is we're all interim pastors. And in one sense, that's sobering. I have friends in the UK, as I'm sure you do, and one of them pastors at this beautiful church in Oxford called St. Aldate's, Stephen Foster. And on the back of St. Aldate's is this plaque that lists all the vicars, all the senior pastors, and it goes back 800-900 years. Yeah. Now, if that doesn't humble you, but we have such this hero mentality, especially in America, of like, and now the story begins. Nah. Our lives matter, but the story's not about us.
Yeah. I'm going to read something that you wrote about this in the blog, just to encourage you to read the blog. You wrote, recognize and respect where you've come from and where they've come from. Recognize where you are reaping where others have sown. Praise the shoulders you're standing on. Repair bridges that have been broken if possible. Rebuild fences that need mending. Yeah. Powerful words. What would be your advice to somebody, the biggest piece of advice, stepping into a new role in an organization right now?
I think you've got to know the story. You've got to know the story so you know where some of the pain points are. And so you can know where the ruins are, where the old bridges are, where the old fences were. And some of those you may not want to rebuild, but you ought to at least know. And, this is where I've also been helped by my academic work. When I did my doctoral work at Durham in the UK, I learned a skill that was the blend of sociological situational analysis, and then paired with theological reflection. And many evangelical seminaries, this is not a knock, but many evangelical seminaries are so good at teaching us how to think biblically and theologically, but we're not trained to think sociologically. And so we ignore the questions of history, we ignore the questions of psychological impact on people. So I think if a pastor comes in, adopt some of those tools. And the simplest sociological tool is history, the tools of the historian. If you were an anthropologist, you'd come in and you'd say, tell me the story of this people, of this land, so that's what you'd want to know.
Yeah, that's great. So as we move on to the next one, which is provide clarity, I just want to talk about the fact that in our work, this is huge. I mean, we see so many ministry organizations just drifting towards complexity. The communication and messaging gets muddled. People don't understand what's going on. So important. You say at the end of your blog, disappointment is inevitable. Nobody likes to admit that a leader has limitations, but every leader has limitations. Unhealthy leaders choose to ignore them. But I also think unhealthy leaders are grown out of lack of clarity. I mean, it rises and falls on clear expectations. Talk about that, providing clarity.
Well, maybe we could say it this way, Tim. There's clarity about expectations and there's clarity about your own limitations. And you have to have clarity about both of those things because part of, and they're connected. So when you provide clarity about what you expect of others and what they can expect of you, it actually also forces you to name your own limitations.
Well, it's self-awareness, right?
It absolutely is self-awareness, and it fights against this fleshly impulse toward pride, where we want to think that we are the unicorn leader that can actually do all the things that a pastor is expected to do, and we can do them all equally well. No, we can't. But recognizing our limitations is then what frees us up for collaboration. And then, so clarity then becomes about the roles. Yeah. What is your role? What is your role? And what is the job ahead of you? What does it look like to actually be doing your task well within this? And then, there's all kinds of tools for this, right? There's clarity about strategy. There's clarity about roles. There's clarity about ourselves. But I think just taking the time to do this, Tim, I have not, the first 2 years, especially the first year, I wrote more in my Evernote than I think I ever have written. And I'd keep a note open and I'd go back and I got to revise that. That's not how I want to talk about our DNA, or that's not how I want to talk about who we are. So you're providing clarity about our identity, our values. Some people call it even, there's a sense in which you're trying to externalize the soul of the organization. When you come into a new place, people know what the church really is, and they won't tell you directly. But again, this is like the tools of an anthropologist. You get them talking, and you'll be like, "Oh, I get this." Like I picked up Rockharbor. People lit up when they talked about radical generosity. Oh, we gave away more money one year than or they talk about radical sort of going. I heard about the Go campaign over and over again. There was this year that we were all going to go somewhere. And when people light up about stuff, that's your clue. Oh, this is a core piece of the soul of the organization. But your job as the leader is to externalize the soul of the organization. What I mean is put it into words. Because if it doesn't live in words, it only lives in a person. And this is getting beyond transitions here, but unhealthy organizations are overly dependent on a singular individual.
Say that again.
Unhealthy organizations are overly dependent on a singular individual because everything lives in the person.
Right.
So they go, what do we need to do for Easter this year? I don't know. We better ask the pastor. What should we do about baptisms or child dedication? I don't know. We better ask pastor. And that's the first telltale sign to me that this is an unhealthy organization, because if it all lives inside the individual, then we're overly dependent on that. He's become the sun in the solar system. Instead of saying, no, we've got to externalize it. And these set of values, these set of convictions, this is what we're orbiting around. This is what and what that actually allows you to do is empower more leaders. Now that clarity, we all see it, and now we can all run toward it.
How much, Glenn, and this is a side note, does that play into some of the leadership meltdown that we see nationally in ministry organizations?
I mean, I suspect a lot. Because, again, you take the myth of the heroic individual, and then you combine it with an individual who refuses to codify or externalize culture into statements and practices, and And so now everything has to be calibrated around that individual. And but listen, a human being was not meant to bear that kind of weight. So human beings, we all have breaking points. And this is maybe the other myth of leadership health, Tim, is I think we have this notion that if we did enough spiritual practices, we would never have a breaking point. And I just want to say, this side of our resurrection, we all have a breaking point. We all have a breaking point. So you could have the best Sabbaths and the best rhythms and the best routines and all this stuff, but if you push too fast, if you carry too much weight, you will crack. We are jars of clay. And the treasure is Christ in us, not us, right?
Amen.
So at some point, we have to give up this myth of the heroic individual, take the time to write down things, externalize things. And sometimes that'll be a collaborative process and a really wonderful team building process for a new leader. We did a lot of that. And you keep adding to it. You keep adding to this sort of library of language and practices and frameworks. I mean, we're compiling it now at Rockharbor. We're like, man, let's get a little book together of all the different frameworks and tools and that we use, because that's a way. Again, anthropologists, when you study a tribe, what's one of the things you look at? Not just their language and their rituals. You're going to look up their artifacts. You're going to look at this ancient whatever stone or this artifact. Same idea. What's a church's artifacts? That will reveal their culture. But if there are no artifacts, and if the answer to every question is ask pastor, we're in trouble.
Yeah, and there's a direct tension with culture that lifts up the heroic individual.
Yeah.
Whereas the way of Jesus is so different.
Yes.
And I think that leads into your next lesson, which is directional versus collaborative leadership is so important. And I know you share a lot about this in your book, The Resilient Pastor. You should read that. Amazing. What are some best practices around when we need to be directional and when we need to be collaborative in our leadership?
I think on the meta level, we are tasked with being directional, and part of leadership means having vision. You can see farther down the road than the rest of the people in the organization. So there is a part of it where you say, man, the meta direction, 3, 4, 5 years, maybe even 10 years, you see something. You're given the gift of vision. But I think collaboration really comes in when we say, all right, so what's the next step now? What's the next 6 months? What's the next 12 months? Maybe even what's the next 18 months? And I think that's the delicate blend. It's hard to sort of say, let's all seek God as all 10 of us as an eldership on the meta, direct. I think you have to come in to say, guys, I think this is the general direct. We are this kind of church. Like I came in saying, gathering everything that I'm hearing, here's the 3 words that I would like to suggest are the DNA of Rockharbor: encounter, formation, mission. So that's meta. Then we go, okay, I think this next season is about formation. What do you think? So now we're testing it. Now there's a certain layer of collaboration there where I'm proposing and they're responding. And then there's another layer down. Okay, so we're going to focus on formation for the next year. What do you guys think that means? Now we're collaborating on, gosh, I think it means we really dig into our table groups. Or I think it means we, come up with a framework for how formation happens, and boom, the ideas start popping. It's funny, Tim, you're a worship leader. I think you'll appreciate this, but it's like songwriting. You've been in a songwriting session, someone comes in, you're like, what do you want to write about? I don't know. What do you want to write about? And well, this is going to be a long day of co-writing, But if someone comes in and goes, I've got to start, I've got an idea, or I read this poem, or here, you go, all right, let's run with that idea. Creativity always, human creativity is always derivative. It's never out of nothing. It's never ex nihilo. We're always working with pre-existing content, right? So there's some measure of a leader saying directional leadership. I'm giving you some building blocks, and now, what are we going to build with these yellow, blue, red bricks of Lego? What are we going to do together?
Yeah. It's interesting for me. I've always been a collaborative leader, and I often feel pressured when I'm backed into a directional corner. Talk about tension. And how you lean into tension in collaborative leadership, and how you work out when it's healthy or unhealthy.
You mean when a team wants to pull in a different direction, that kind of thing? Yeah. I think so. In the Resilient Pastor, I suggest this sort of matrix, this quadrant, this 2x2, and it's freedom and vision. And freedom and vision, we typically set on a line, and we go, you either the more freedom you want to give someone, that means the less vision you got to give them. And I suggest no, let's put it in a 2x2. So let's see if we can do this here. If you have no vision and no freedom, and you work in that organization, you're going crazy, because it's just like, I have no freedom to change anything, and I have no clue where we're going. So, not going to last long. They'll be calling Slingshot for another job soon. Now, if you have high freedom but unclear vision, that's chaos. That's the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? And I've been part of church and ministry environments where it was quote unquote empowering, but it was really just chaotic. Like every department was running. And the only people who knew how chaotic it was the production team or the facilities team. Because they're like, we have to support how many events this weekend, So that's chaos, where it's high freedom but unclear vision. Now, when you do low freedom but clear vision, that I used to call that clone, but actually I've started to think that's cultivation. That's where you start someone. You're going to start a new staff person or a new leader by saying, I'm not going to give you a ton of freedom, but I'm going to give you very clear vision. This is your role. I'm a big sports guy. I think, on a basketball team, this is like telling your rookie, your job is to play great defense and grab every rebound you can. And don't shoot the ball. Like when you get it, pass it, Now, when you move up the chart, you go to high freedom and clear vision. This is where, it's like the Golden State Warriors in their heyday, or my team, the Denver Nuggets last year.
I'm with you.
Come on now.
I'm a Nuggets fan.
Where you don't have to call a lot of plays. That's what you don't call a lot of plays. You have 5 high IQ guys on the court, and they figure it out. And that to me is that's peak collaboration.
Right.
And it doesn't happen at every level of the organization, but it ought to happen at the highest levels. And even then, it doesn't happen in every decision. But every so often, boy, it's magic when it happens.
So high collaboration, talk about a high-performing team and how diversity of thought plays into that, and how diversity in general plays into that.
We're in the midst of this now because we've added 3 key leaders and key positions to our team, and you can feel the viewpoint diversity. And different people have different comfort levels with disagreement, And so I'll say to the team, different perspectives is great. Different camps is not. What we don't want is the staff to kind of say, I'm going with it. They want more whatever, more of this, more of that, more small groups. No, more events, or, more Holy Spirit time. No, more quiet contemplation time. We can have different perspectives, but we can't form different camps. That's what we don't want. So I am, and maybe this is partly the academic thing, I really love the dialectical approach to tension. This is Hegelian's dialect, where there's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So I'm very comfortable with that. Like if someone says this, I really want to hear someone say, what's the counterpoint?
Right.
Okay, here's the counterpoint. Okay, so what's our Rockharbor synthesis? It's not necessarily what's the middle. It's not necessarily the middle way. It's just what's our synthesis about this decision right here, right now.
That's really helpful. I've got so many follow-ups, but that might be another podcast episode. You close out your list with one that really is the glue to all of this, and that's to create space to pray and listen to God. Creating space to pray and listen to God. It should be obvious to us, yet so often it's the lesson we have to keep learning the hard way, right? Talk more about that.
I think in the early months, 6 months, whatever, it was easy to seek the Lord because I felt so in over my head. I felt desperate.
Desperately dependent.
I was like, Lord, I need your help. I'm being stretched in every way. And I think what begins to happen to all of us, it's human nature. Things start, quote unquote, working. And you go, that's great. And I give more of my time to my ability to problem solve, my ability to persuade, and those skills matter. And it's not I don't want to create a false either or, but I do think there is a proper priority of things. And I have found the challenge that I have to fight for that space to say I need to regularly create space on my calendar, build it in on Monday mornings. I don't take any appointments or meetings prior to lunch on Monday, typically. And I need that reliable space to say, I'm going to go for a long walk. Now, I'm lucky enough that long walk can be by the beach, but I need the time to listen, to be still, to see what emerges even in my own soul. We're all leading out of something. And we could be leading out of our woundedness. We could be leading out of our insecurities. We could be leading out of our pressures. Or we could be leading out of being deeply loved by God. And if nothing else, that's why we need space. I want to be careful that I'm not saying spend time with the Lord so that he can download more vision. I'm very aware, and you will appreciate this as a former worship leader yourself, like it's very easy to functionalize our intimacy with God. Where I am getting close to God because I need God to say something. And I think it's so important as leaders that we draw near to God just to be with God. I want to be with God just to be with God so that I can lead out of that place of belovedness.
Yeah. Glenn, it's interesting you talk about that desperate dependence in the early days. I remember, nearly 25 years ago, moving to the US from Australia to a new leadership role, culture changing, everything changing, and how 2 or 3 years on, my wife and I would say to each other, we miss being that dependent on God. That's how we always need to live. And it's cultivating that dependence on him, and that can only come with time. So, Glenn, as we close the conversation, talking to leaders who might be in that overwhelmed state at the front end of transition right now, how would you sum this up, and what would be your advice to them?
Take a deep breath. Trust the long game. Trust the slow work of the kingdom. All the parables Jesus tells about the kingdom of God, like a seed in the ground, like yeast in the dough, the kingdom work is hidden, it's slow, it's in the dark, so it feels like a lot. You can't change it all now. It won't all turn around quickly, but trust the long, slow work of the kingdom, of the Holy Spirit at work. And take a breath. It'll be okay.
Yeah, that's a good word. Undervalued competencies of leadership are simply obedience and showing up and continuing to show up.
Yeah.
Glenn, I love talking to people that are way smarter than I am, just like you. And this has been a great conversation. So many insights. Thank you for how you serve and the difference you're making. And I know there's things that you're going to want to share with other leaders from this conversation. Please share and subscribe. Thanks for being with us today. And until next time, stay curious and reach for the remarkable.